Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to another episode of Legal Ease, the first after the present Hajj season 2015. Tonight I'm joined by Advocate Neville Melville, who was the former Ombudsman for Banking Services. He has had extensive experience in dispute resolution and having first cut his teeth as the functionary of the National Peace Accord in KwaZulu-Natal in the run-up to South Africa's first democratic election. He went on to found the Independent Complaints Commission, and Advocate Melville is knowledgeable in the field of consumer law, having compiled the book The Consumer Protection Act Made Easy, and he co-authored Know Your Consumer Rights. Advocate Melville holds an LLM degree from the University of Natal. Now, for us to understand his role, we really need to understand what is the role of the Ombudsman. But first, let me take an opportunity to greet Advocate Melville. Good evening, Advocate Melville.
Good evening.
And welcome to Legal Ease.
Thank you very much.
Now, recently we've heard a lot about consumer rights, etc.
Yes.
Advocate Melville, what is your role primarily and what organization do you belong to?
Right. I'm the Ombudsman for Consumer Goods and Services in South Africa. And basically what an ombudsman is an independent and impartial person who either investigates or facilitates the settlement by mediation or other means of disputes between people. Ordinarily, it would be the citizens, whether it would be against a government institution. For instance, we have the Public Protector performs that role here. Or it could be in respect of complaints against businesses, as is the case of my office, or against, for instance, newspapers, or we even have a tax ombudsman as a newcomer here in South Africa.
Now, there's no real overlap between your office and another. So, for example, the insurance or banking ombudsman or the ombudsman for the motor industry, they would adjudicate matters entrusted to their particular field. Yours seems to appeal more to the ordinary consumer, the man in the streets, the man that contracts for any goods or services of any kind.
Yes, very much so. We have a very broad jurisdiction. It would cover virtually anything you can conceive of that you can go and buy at a shop, or any service that you would pay for where someone comes and does some work for you, repairs something, anything along those lines. The only exceptions, you've mentioned some of them already, is motor, the other financial ombudsman who specialize in those particular fields. There's also a credit ombudsman, and also if anything falls under a different regulator, so for instance medical or legal for that matter, there are other ways and means that you need to deal with those particular things. But ordinary day-to-day purchases and services that you would be involved in, you would be able to come and complain to my office.
Now, it's not just limited to natural persons. So even if you are a sole proprietor, you could still be considered a consumer.
Yes, very much so.
Or a franchisee.
Right.
And if you're a corporate entity with a turnover not exceeding 2 million, I think.
Yes, that's quite correct.
So it's not just basically, the consumer is not just basically ordinary people. It incorporates legal entities, sole proprietors, franchisees. What about trusts?
Yes, certainly that's also provided for, again with this limitation of the 2 million rand, anything under 2 million rand in terms of annual turnover, and then that would qualify you as an ordinary consumer.
Now, just by way of background, where does the notion of an ombudsman comes from?
Well, the word itself is an old Norse word, or derived from an old Norse word of ombudsmader, which, as you detect, doesn't quite sound like the modern ombudsman. The name ombudsman was first used in the Scandinavian countries about 2 centuries ago, but there's actually some thought that the concept itself was uplifted from the Islamic countries, and there was a functionary there called the Muhtasib, who went around from town to town and made sure that everyone complied with the law. So that is the theory that one of the Swedish kings had visited there some centuries ago and picked up the idea there and gave it a different name when he got back to Sweden, as the case was.
Now, in the hierarchy of consumer goods and rights, there are 3 different or 4 different organizations. Where does your organization fall in that hierarchy?
Right. If I could perhaps explain, if you could imagine a pyramid, right at the apex you have the tribunal, which is the body that adjudicates on matters, which is the appeal body, and which can actually impose administrative fines and declare conduct to be prohibited. Then the next level down is the National Consumer Commission, which is the actual regulator. It has investigative powers. It can make orders as to what should be complied with and so forth. And if its orders are not carried out, it can actually approach the tribunal then at the top and apply to have a fine imposed. But if someone's not happy with one of the decisions that it's made, they can in turn actually go and approach the tribunal as an appeal body and have that matter considered and perhaps overturned. And then the next level down, almost at the mezzanine level, would be the alternative dispute resolution bodies such as my office and also the motor ombudsman. Also in that category would be the provincial dispute handling bodies that are set up at that level, and any alternative dispute resolution entity, for instance, people who provide mediation and arbitration services. And then right at the bottom, you would have the option, of course, of going directly to the supplier, preferably at a centralized point. And in fact, there's a code that came out recently that requires every supplier to be able to assist people as far as their complaints are concerned and have a proper mechanism in place to do so.
Now, recently, there's been lots of press reports of so-called pyramid schemes. People have been affected. I read today that there was a scheme in KwaZulu-Natal that ran into billions of rands. If I'm an aggrieved consumer, let's say I'm participated in the scheme, would I be able to turn to your offices for relief?
Yeah, I think those schemes are by and large based on financial schemes. And I think this particular one that you're referring to, there was an intervention from the financial service authorities here in South Africa.
Right.
So I think it would be in that space generally that there would be an intervention.
So it doesn't fall within goods and services as we know them, but it falls within a financial package or
yes,
promises made
within
there.
that regulatory space, yes.
Now, your office seeks to do what? Let's say I'm an aggrieved consumer. I went into a shop in a mall and I was given a small piece of paper that evidences my purchase of a floodlight, or I booked a ticket for a bus ride, or I booked a ticket for a holiday, and I went and I couldn't get the airline to honor my flight. I might have been bumped off. So, what does your office do, and how do you do this?
Right, the first starting point obviously is we get the complaint in, we decide that it is for us in terms of its age and everything else, that it doesn't fall within somebody else's jurisdiction. Once we've decided that, then we would send it off to the particular entity that was against, and basically we would give them 15 business days or working days in which to resolve it, so they get that last chance, so to speak. But if they don't do so, what they have to do is report back to us and explain why they haven't done so. If they have any report, or if they have any investigation that they've had done by an expert or whatever, they would need to provide that to us. And another thing that they have to do is actually inform the consumer within that period that the consumer has a right to approach our office if the consumer is not satisfied with the way it's been dealt with. So once it comes to us, we would, if we're told that it's been settled, we would confirm that with the consumer, or if we've been given some sort of explanation, we would consider that. In many instances, we may feel that that was a justified explanation, and then we would go back to the consumer and explain to them why we do not believe that the matter should settle in their favour. But in the vast majority of cases, what we do is we try and facilitate a settlement, and that can take all sorts of different forms. It could be a matter of phoning the different parties. Sometimes it's just a question of doing the administration, making sure someone's at home when the repairman gets there to come and have a look at the thing, whatever the case may be. But we find in the vast majority of cases that the matter is actually settled through those sort of interventions. In a much smaller number, it actually goes where the parties don't see eye to eye. We can then make a written determination in the matter, setting out what the facts were, how the code applied, what the law says, and based on that, what our recommendation is as to how the matter should be settled. And in very exceptional cases where there's no settlement at all, we would inform the parties of the right to approach the National Consumer Commission and ultimately the tribunal.
Now, the 3 R's that we often hear about that the consumer is entitled to, can you expand on that?
Yes, certainly. They're shorthand for a refund, a repair, or a replacement. So basically what it really means is if you buy something and within a period of 6 months of you having bought it, it is for some reason or other defective and you can't use it or doesn't live up to the expectations of it, doesn't perform the service it's supposed to, you can go back into the shop and decide which of those 3 you want. So you can't have a repair foisted upon you. You can't be told, no, we'll take in your cell phone, we'll repair it, we'll give it back to you. You're not happy with that, we'll take it again. You could agree to that, but if you don't agree to that, you can actually insist upon having the matter, having a replacement rather, if they have got a replacement available, not always possible, or to get your money back.
Now, it's interesting that you touch on cell phones. That itself is it could be problematic, right? Because part of it could be regulated by ICASA, but I think your view is that the handset itself is something that you can adjudicate.
Yes, certainly. We have many suppliers that are participants in the scheme that also sell the equipment that goes with the use of the cell phone networks, be it a handset or an iPad or whatever the case may be. And certainly we deal with complaints relating to those and relating to the contracts and so forth. But there's just a bit of a query at present as to whether the cell phone service providers would actually fall within our jurisdiction. We do have, for instance, MTN has volunteered as a member. We do deal with their complaints. But as far as the other cell phone companies are concerned, that is something that the Commission is looking into, and it will give us its view in due course as to whether or not we should be dealing with those matters.
But there has to be a baseline, right? There has to be a material defect with the goods. It can't just be, I mean, let's say you bought it and you didn't like the color, you know, you had buyer's remorse. Would that
right.
be a basis?
Yes, that is a very common misperception, that people somehow believe that with the Consumer Protection Act coming into effect, that contracts no longer stand. You can buy something and change your mind tomorrow. That's not the case at all. If you've had the opportunity to examine it, and there's nothing materially defective with it, you do not have the right to cancel the whole transaction. And when I say materially defective, that means something that is of a serious nature that would have impacted on your decision to buy it. And for instance, if you bought a flashlight and the globe burnt out, I don't think under those circumstances you'd be entitled to go back and say, I want a new flashlight, because very easily and cheaply the bulb could be replaced and you'd be in as good a position as you were in the beginning. So then I think the supplier under those circumstances would be entitled to repair. But if the whole thing was defective and it would take extensive repairs to sort it out, and we find this, even though it's not in our jurisdiction, but we're aware from our colleagues in the motor industry, at the Motor Industry Ombudsman, that obviously if a whole engine blows up and so forth, then it may be a different story and there may be a question of getting a replacement vehicle.
Okay, thank you very much. That's a convenient place to take a short break. Please stay tuned. Join us after the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back to Legal Ease. As a reminder that we're talking to Advocate Neville Melville, and we're covering the area of goods and services that you might be unhappy with as a consumer. Now, the matter can be referred to the Office of the Ombudsman, and as always, you are invited to call in if you're unhappy with any of the services or goods that you bought. And as always, our number is 011 086 7777. I'll repeat it, 011 086 7777. If you are unhappy as a consumer, here's your opportunity to get some really good advice on that. Now, just before the break, Advocate Melville, we were talking about the consumer and the demand that he could make let's say, I think you stopped at the flashlight, that it requires a minimal intervention. So you can't really demand a replacement if the item can be repaired reasonably.
If there was just a component that
Yes.
was the problem, yes.
Yeah. And we spoke about a motor vehicle, for example. Now, what about second-hand motor vehicles? That is a really problematic area.
Right, very much so. I don't envy my colleague, the motor ombudsman, because he does deal with those. The thing is that they are covered, any second-hand goods are covered by the Act.
Right.
And I think what makes it difficult for the dealers is they are also covered by this so-called 6-month implied warranty. So within 6 months of buying it, something goes wrong, then they would be liable. The only exception is if they've actually pointed out the defect to you, that specific defect,
Yeah.
and you accept it. So I think it's different if they say, well, this is an old banger, you take it at your own risk, from them saying, look, the gearbox is a bit shot and it smokes and this, that and the other, because then you know specifically
Yes.
what the problems are and you're accepting it as is. But otherwise the so-called footstoots clause
Yes.
no longer applies and can no longer be used, because that's specifically excluded, by the actual legislation. So it's now specified that the Act takes precedence over any contractual arrangement that you may have.
So in other words, you can't then agree that, look, this Act doesn't apply to us, this is a private deal and I'm not adhering to the provisions of the Act.
Quite so, and that's something I think our legal fraternity here really grapple with. I think almost on a daily basis we are told by attorneys, but look at our agreement, it says this, that and the other. Well, one doesn't really have to if what the agreement says is contrary to what the rights are that are conferred by the Act itself, the Consumer Protection Act. They will definitely overrule any agreement to the contrary.
Now, earlier on we spoke about membership. Does the scheme have voluntary membership?
Prior to April, the end of April this year, it was on a voluntary basis. But since then, the Code of Conduct was approved by the Minister for the DTI. And at the same time, our office was accredited as the official dispute resolution body or ombudsman for the entire industry. So anyone who falls within the so-called supply chain, that's all the different businesses that are involved, all the way down from virtually and literally the farm down to the person who sells it to you over the counter. Each and every one of those entities is obliged to now register with us and contribute to the payment of our expenses according to their respective size.
So every industry, every supplier of goods and services has to register.
Yes, as long as they're not in the motor industry or any
Yes.
other exclusion. Yes, they do have to register, and also they have to then pay the amount that's applicable to the size of their business.
So Pat the plumber and Joe the baker he's got
Yes,
no,
yes.
he has to register with you.
Very much so. It's going to be a major undertaking, but we've started obviously with the bigger firms, and we have got a business, an outside business that's helping us actually identify all the parties, contact them, and to sign them up.
Okay, I think we have a call on the line. Caller, please go ahead. Hello? Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead. I think we have a problem there.
All right.
Okay, so we were at the point of discussing that registration is mandatory, and every single... Now, what happens when somebody decides, I'm not registering? It's too expensive, I'm paying levies, I'm paying this, I'm paying that, I'm not registering.
Yes, well certainly there was a whole public process of consultation before the code was brought into effect. So they had the opportunity to speak out, and unfortunately they missed the boat if they didn't do so. But the situation now is if they don't pay or they don't register, then they are contravening the Consumer Protection Act, and it specifically makes provision that we would be entitled to sue for the fee. Obviously we don't want to go about doing that. That's not our core business. We would much rather that people, in the interests of their own businesses and their consumers, that they become members on a voluntary basis or without us having to chase them, and that they comply. But another aspect is if a business fails to cooperate with us, that can be taken into consideration and aggravation against it in a matter that goes before the Commission, that's the National Consumer Commission, or the Tribunal. So in other words, a larger penalty could be imposed because they didn't, right from the beginning when they had the opportunity to do so, try and resolve the matter through the Ombudsman. So for instance, if they, to put it in plain terms, lawyer up and decide they're going to oppose at every point, that may well count against them.
We have a call on the line. Caller, can you hear us? If you can, please go.
Hello.
Yes, yes, we can hear you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
How are you?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Okay, look, I have a problem with a Volvo car that I bought from Volvo Branston from the dealership.
Okay, that unfortunately, as you heard Advocate Neville Melville say, motor complaints are excluded. So there is an ombudsman for the motor industry. There's an ombudsman for the banking industry. There's an ombudsman for certain other industries. These, the ones that Advocate Melville presides over, is general goods and services. So where there is an industry already dedicated to a particular complaints area, for example, like cars, well, that's where you have to go. This show covers all other industries except those that we've mentioned as excluded.
Okay.
I'm sorry we can't help you.
Thank you very much. Jazakallah.
You're welcome. Advocate Melville, give us examples of some of the complaints, interesting complaints that you've had.
Well, we've had all sorts. We had one just the other day that comes to mind, where a wedding photographer claimed that they weren't able to accommodate someone. They weren't able to accept a cancellation because they couldn't find anyone else for that particular day, and they refused to actually give any sort of a refund of the deposit that was paid. And we did some investigation and actually got someone to phone up and ask for an appointment for that very same day, and we were told that they were fully booked. So we then presented that to the photographer and said, well, then you obviously haven't made any loss on that, any actual loss.
Yes.
So therefore you can only claim the direct costs of the cancellation, and you must refund the rest of the money. And ultimately it settled on that basis.
So in this case, he was a service provider,
yes,
and he had a complaint against his own customer. I think
it was the other way around.
Yes.
The customer had tried to cancel the deal and
yes,
get a refund.
I see. I think we have another caller on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Hello.
Hello. We can hear you. Walaikum salam.
I bought a geyser from a supplier directly and had the geyser commissioned by a authorized plumber, and a week or so later the geyser, there was something wrong with there was some defect in the geyser itself. So I called the supplier in, he sent his technicians, he had a look at it, and we were getting the water through the mixers were coming out of hot, cold, hot, cold, cold, hot. It was coming on and off all the time. I complained to them. They came once, they came twice. I had a look at it. They said there's something wrong with the mixer itself that's in the bathroom. Subsequently, I called in another registered plumber. He came and had a look at it, and he did advise me that the geyser flow inside is something defective there. Then we had a meeting with the supplier and my private plumber, a registered private plumber. I had a meeting with him, both of them, and they came in here, and the supplier of the geyser then said that, okay, we'll take the geyser back, which he made an appointment to come and remove. On the day in question, my registered plumber came down here, waited for him to remove the geyser, at which time we had bought another geyser and to another supplier, and my registered plumber was ready to install the geyser when the original supplier was supposed to have removed his. The supplier didn't arrive for almost an hour, and my plumber's time was valuable. So he says, can I please remove it here? And we'll have to charge the guy. I said, well, he removed the plumber's, they removed the original geyser, and he reinstalled, not reinstalled, he installed another brand new geyser. Now, I paid for the installation of the original geyser to my supplier. I only bought the geyser, which was defective. My plumber installed the geyser already, all right, and found it defective, and the supplier then agreed to take the geyser away, which was fine. Now, I paid him for the geyser. Now, who is now responsible for the second installation of the geyser? Because I paid my plumber already the first installation, which is about 3,000 rand.
Okay, so we understand
And
the
now
question.
I had to pay him a second time
Yes.
to install a second geyser. I paid my plumber a second fee of 3,000 rand.
Understood. Okay, we understand the
And
question.
what has happened is that the supplier then, who took the geyser away, the original geyser, the amount that we paid him was 7,000 rand. He deducted 1,500 rand from the original geyser amount. And
So
he
you have
said
two
to me,
questions. Just to summarize, the 1,500 rand is the original supplier entitled to, and are you entitled to the labor costs for the second geyser, 3,000 rands?
My question is that, am I entitled to the original amount for which I purchased the geyser? And the cost of the installation, the cost of the installation that was done the first time.
Okay, thank you for the question. Let's give Advocate Melville a chance to reply.
All right, thank you very much.
Right, thank
do
you.
I need to stay on the phone?
No, you can listen online.
All right, okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. But based on the facts as you've explained them to us, certainly it would seem that there was a major defect which rendered it inoperable in the actual geyser itself. So that would entitle you to cancel and to get a full refund without any deduction. So it's not a question of you merely cancelling because you've wanted to put in a different geyser or you've changed your mind or anything like that. So as far as the Consumer Protection Act is concerned, that's very clear. That would be without any cost or charge that you would be entitled to your refund, and it would in fact be at the expense of the supplier to bring about that refund. So certainly I think that also goes to your second question, that it would be at his expense to then reinstall the new geyser. But I think in terms of our ordinary law, in any event, quite apart from the Consumer Protection Act, one would look at this as a contract, and this is the sort of damage that might be expected to flow from a breach of the contract. So I think you would be covered by that as well, even if you didn't go through the consumer protection processes.
Thank you for that answer. It's a convenient place to go for a short break. Please stay tuned and join us on the other side of these ad breaks. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You're tuned to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. And tonight we're hosting Advocate Neville Melville, and he's the Ombudsman for Consumer Goods and Services. Thus far, we've heard that there have been a number of complaints from various sectors. Just by way of summary, and you reminded, the viewers that the lines are open. You're welcome to call in. We don't have a lot of time, and our numbers are 011 086 7777. With regard to typical complaints, or there could never be a typical complaint, but where would be the most number of complaints that you've dealt with?
Well, that is probably not surprising given the fact that everyone has at least one in the country, is cell phones, matters relating to cell phones, and I've already touched on that. Then a very broad...
Sorry, does that include the cell phone calls that drop? And
no, those are dealt with by ICASA. Those are network issues. So that's definitely where you would have to go with those. So what we would deal with is a problem with the handset itself, a problem with the agreement, or something you were told you were going to get and you didn't get, you got the wrong agreement, or quite often around cancellation. People want to cancel or move their number or whatever the case may be. So we've had a lot around that. Those we have looked at. I did mention that certainly as far as MTN complaints are concerned, we deal with all of those. With the other cell phone companies, there's some debate as to whether or not they fall under our jurisdiction. But that's by far the biggest category. And during the course of this year so far, we've had 877 of those cases.
It's like 3 a day on average.
Right, pretty much weekends included, yes. And then the next big category that we deal with is furniture. And I think the reason we get so many furniture-related items is this represents a big purchase for a lot of people. Sometimes it's equivalent to a year's salary. So they have great expectations when they get the new suite or whatever the case may be. And
just we need to pause there before we go ahead. We have a call on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
My name is Yusuf. I'm phoning from Pretoria. I've got a problem. I bought one of these vacation timeshares.
Yes.
With 30 points. And what is transpired now for the past 2 years, every time I try to get accommodation, I cannot get accommodation. They always got stories. And they're charging me a substantial amount, 6,000 rand a year.
Right. So you want to know what you can do about that?
That's right. I'm trying to cancel, and they said, no, this is a lifetime contract.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for raising that. That is a very topical issue. And the reason for that is the National Consumer Commission is at this time investigating that, and it's a matter it's gone before, or was going before the tribunal. So there have been various complaints, particularly about the point system and the very self-same thing that you're raising, this inability to get a week when you want and so forth. And I think what's happened as a result of that is the major companies involved in that field are now moving away from that model, and they are actually allocating points which correspond with particular weeks and so forth, like the old systems where you actually own the timeshare, so that's falling away. But in addition to that, there's this question of the so-called evergreen contracts, one of which you seem to be locked into with the no opportunity to escape from it. And that is another thing that the Commission's about to make a call on, and whether or not that will be followed through in the tribunal is something that we wait to see. But certainly these sort of complaints we do deal with, and we try and arrange some sort of a negotiation between the parties whilst we await that outcome.
Just on that point now, let's say, what would Yusuf do? I mean, he's now the aggrieved consumer.
Right.
What practical steps must he take?
Well, certainly the first point that anyone should take that has a complaint is find out who's the centralized person within that organization that deals with complaints. So you may be talking to a salesperson or someone at a low level and you're getting nowhere. So you should actually say, well, what is your complaint process? Every business needs to have that now. They actually need to inform consumers of that. So once you've found that out, you can go to that person. You may find they have a very different approach once they realize it. Because I think at the end of the day, most businesses are looking to protect their reputations and to look for a continued business, because it's very expensive to find new business and sign up new people. So if you're unsuccessful there and you've had the complaint there for at least 15 business days, at that point you can approach us and then we'll take it further and try and assist you.
That's 3 working weeks, 15. And so they could make an application online?
Yes, certainly. Yeah, that's something that sped up our processes. We have a computerized complaint management system. You can make your complaint online and it goes straight into the system, and then it's allocated to someone. So that speeds up the process quite considerably over the old-fashioned phoning in and speaking to someone and having them laboriously write it down or capture it with keystrokes.
What's the website details?
It's www.cgso.org.za.
And they can Google that as well?
Yes, yeah, they should find us.
With regard to other aspects of complaints, you've had electrical appliances?
Yes, certainly. That's not a major area, but that is something that we do pick up quite a lot, about 143. And then services, which I think I touched upon earlier, and that can be very broad. virtually anything you can conceive of where you pay someone money to do something for you other than servicing your car. So it could be cleaning your rings, the wedding photos that we've talked about, the wedding venues. We've even had complaints relating to funeral services and so forth. So yes, very broad indeed. Anything to do with, we heard about installation of geysers from your earlier caller and so forth. So yes, as long as it's something where someone's done some work for you and you've actually paid them for that, then that's something that you can complain about.
Building material and hardware supplies sounds like a very difficult area to adjudicate. I mean, it could be cement, the quality
Right.
of bricks.
I think most of those complaints are around non-delivery, and we find a lot of them happen in the outlying areas where there are not necessarily the usual stores that you see, but the smaller businesses there. And I think, and I don't like to generalize, but certainly we gain the impression that the standards of service in the broad understanding of the word are not those that you would expect when you went to one of the big hardware stores in one of the major centres. So there are all sorts of problems around that, and it's something that does need to be addressed if those businesses want to remain competitive.
Food and beverage is an interesting subcategory.
Right.
Let's assume I find a fly in my drink.
Right.
I mean, the shock and horror of having drunk the drink
Yes.
and then discovering, you know, the fly.
Yes.
I mean, what can I expect as a consumer?
Well, that you may be surprised to discover you're not going to get the multi-million-dollar payout that you might have expected from watching too much television.
Right.
So you actually, for something like that, would have to prove almost on a medical basis that you've suffered some long-term effect as a result of that shock for you to be able to ground any sort of a major claim. But I think generally if you could show that you did eat something like that and you became physically ill, then it's a much easier question of paying for your hotel expense, not your hotel, hospital rather, and compensating you for any time that you were off work and that sort of thing.
So it's real quantifiable damage, not
generally.
shock, not shock and horror.
Yeah,
Okay, I
very
understand we have
unusually
a call on the line.
Hello, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam.
Yeah, I just want to know, can I put my complaint?
Please, yes.
Yeah, I just want to know about if you appoint attorney to do your inheritance, and the attorney doesn't do the job, I mean, as it should be done. Because what we did, we came to the last stage where the property was sold, and we only needed the other heirs to sign, which is 6 of the heirs, and we were 5. But now, Sophie had to make an application to bypass the other heirs, and that was actually the final straw to get this property sold. And then she made an appointment, actually application to the master to bypass, but the outcome was that they refused to bypass the heirs. And now she come and tell us that we have to take them to court, to get them to sign. But I mean, if they don't want to sign, and it costs us 150,000 just to take them to court to actually get them sign, so that we can sell the property. So what must we do? I mean, we're stuck now, and we don't know what to do because the attorney actually doesn't even respond further than what we are now. Shukran.
Okay, thank you for your question. Remember that tonight we're talking about general complaints of consumer goods and services, and if those services are covered by other, let's say, structures such as this one, then it'll be excluded from a complaint to the Consumer Goods Ombudsman. Now, in that case, you'll have the right to approach the Law Society if you believe that it's the attorney's fault. Now, you have the right to write the letter and complain, and the Law Society will receive your complaint and pass that complaint to that attorney, and that attorney will respond in writing. So you might then find that it wasn't the attorney's fault. And I mean, I think you have a very complex matter. I think you also perhaps need to arrange a meeting with the master of the High Court. And he is not really an ombudsman, but he has the power to try and adjudicate disputes between various heirs. Neville, you want to add to that?
No, I think you went to the right man speaking to you there.
Thank you very much. I think we've got another caller on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Good evening. I wanted to know, we had our kitchen renovated, and when we did that, we needed extra electrical points, so we got a plumber and an electrician.
Yes.
And since then, the light, the joining to my kitchen, the bathroom and the other lights have all gone. And I said to the electrician to come and check, and he doesn't want to come. So can I make a complaint?
Good evening. Thank you for your question, Advocate Melville.
Yes, certainly. I think that's very important to know that when you have someone look after your property or do any service to your property, they've got to take reasonable care over it and return it to you in at least as good quality or state as when you actually hand it to them in the first place.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Just another short break. Please stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. You are tuned to Legal Ease, the show that converts legal jargon into legal ease. Now, we're in the last section of the show, and I'm hosting tonight Advocate Neville Melville. We're talking about complaints for consumer goods and services that you may have. Last year, just as a matter of course, there were 4,500 complaints, which really is like 1% of the population. You know, if we take 45 million consumers, which appears to be very, very small in with regard to the overall population. Could mean that they're very happy with the services.
Yes, look, I think obviously there's also an awareness factor.
Yes.
But then I think, and certainly it's been our experience in the time that we've been operational, that certainly the bigger businesses are taking a lot more attention to how they deal with customers and how they resolve complaints, because they realize that by and large it's not really going to help them, allowing it to escalate to ourselves, and at the end of the day they have to pay. So we're finding in fact that they often settling matters where there's no legal obligation for them to do so, purely on the basis of good customer relations.
So the lady that called in now regarding her kitchen, how does the process work? Let's say she reports it after 15 days, 15 working days.
Yes.
So how do you deal with this complaint internally?
Well, so what we would do is then approach the business and make sure that we get from it explanation, and sometimes with the smaller businesses that's not so easy, but anyway we would keep chasing up with them, and what we would try and do is get an understanding from them or what their view is. Sometimes there may be some dispute as to what actually happened. There may be something that needs to be inspected by an independent third party. Then we would arrange that and we would get a report, and based on that we would make a call. Or in some cases we may actually call the parties in if it was a big value claim, and have them in our offices and have a mediation and help the parties themselves arrive at some sort of a resolution that suited all of them.
I understand we have a last call on the line. Caller, please go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Yusuf again.
Alaykum salam, Yusuf.
Will you please repeat that email address which we could send the complaints to?
Certainly.
Jazakallah.
Right, it's www.cgso, that's for Consumer Goods and Service Ombudsman, cgso.org.za.
Jazakallah. Thank you.
Okay,
Pleasure.
you're welcome. Now, how successful are you? I mean, you know, the consumer believes that he's so helpless, there's toothless bodies, etc. How successful is your office?
It depends how you measure success, but if we're talking in terms of getting a matter resolved speedily, by and large we get most cases on average finalized within 40 days. We are always working on that, but it is sometimes difficult because some of these things are protracted. People drag their feet, including the consumers themselves don't always come back to us. But apart from that, by and large, we find in most cases, and sometimes as many as 90% of cases, it varies from time to time, we actually are able to get some, if not all, of the claim that the consumer is making. And that may be some sort of an assistance, some sort of an explanation of why something was, or whatever the case may be. And in very few cases do we actually arrive at the end of the day at a conclusion that the consumer is entirely in the wrong and has no rights at all, and that the supplier needs to do nothing for them. But even where that does happen, at least as an educational process, and they now understand what their rights are and be able to guide themselves in future.
I think that's very commendable, that the target and the DAs. How many days does a business have to respond to your invitation?
So basically they have 15 business days in which to resolve the matter, whether the consumers approach them directly or if we've referred the matter through. That's excluding holidays and weekends and so forth.
Well, that's quite interesting. Is there a limit, an upper limit of the amount I could claim? So, you know, is there, like like in the small claims court, you are confined to an upper limit of 15,000?
Right. No, there's no such limit. We have had some claims running in the millions, but unfortunately those have been the ones that have been fairly fanciful, the sort of, what was it that you mentioned that you might find in your drink or whatever. Someone thinks they're going to be able to retire early because of the shock that they experience, but realistically those claims are not very likely to be entertained.
And with regard to prescription, does the same rules apply?
In terms of the Consumer Protection Act, you have 3 years in which to bring a complaint, so that does accord with the general rule on prescription, the time that you've got to bring an action.
An interesting area is the oppressive, sometimes oppressive terms and conditions that, let's say, franchisors visit on franchisees.
Yes.
How would you be able to deal with that?
Well, I'm aware that the Franchise Association has actually applied to have its own code approved, so that's something that they will ultimately deal with. But just talking in general terms, certainly the franchisees are to a large extent, with very few exceptions, protected by most sections of the Consumer Protection Act, and there's particular reference to what must go into a franchise agreement, and especially those things that they must be advised of in terms of turnovers, profits, what training they're going to get. There's a very extensive schedule that's included in the regulations that were published under the Consumer Protection Act. So if anyone wants to go into a franchise business, they should certainly ask the questions, and they're entitled to get the answers, and they're entitled to get them in writing. And in fact, it actually goes so far as provide that if they do ask questions, so it must be provided to them in writing and be incorporated into the agreement. So they are very broadly protected as far as that's concerned, with very few exceptions, as I mentioned. For instance, the arrangement in respect of what goods you have to sell and so forth. There may be some power that the franchisor has to insist that you sell particular things, but again, that would have to be reasonable. So if you are involved in selling tires, they can't insist that you also supply your the guests and the people who come there with their brand of coffee as well, because that's got nothing to do with the tires. So it wouldn't be justifiable.
Well, that appears to be the end of our show for tonight. It just leaves a few seconds to say thank you to the viewers for having joined us and for your questions, and to Advocate Neville Melville, the Ombudsman, for having taken off time tonight and answered our questions and been such an excellent guest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.